In Conversation with Terry Shepard, award-winning broadcaster, narrator, and author. A deep dive into the writer's craft with the artists and support systems who create the stories we love.
Thanks, Lisa. Stephen G. Eoannou writes award-winning historical fiction. Steve's Rook has been described as Technicolor noir. His story collection about muscle cars brims with sense and details, giving them a multi-dimensional feel. He recently released Yesteryear, a fascinating portrait of the man who created the Lone Ranger. Steve Eoannou, welcome to In Conversation. Yesteryear has had one of the longest pre-launch campaigns that I can remember. How are you doing now that the book is actually out there?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yesteryear's protagonist, the great Fran Stryker, is a legend for those of us who grew up in Detroit and loved the Lone Ranger. How did he first come across your radar?
You know, you mentioned muscle cars and Rook in your intro, and I could tell you where I got the idea for every single story in muscle cars. I can tell you where I was standing and what I was reading when I got the idea for my novel, Rook. I have no idea where I first learned about Fran Stryker. I think I was at a bar or a party, and somebody had mentioned that that the creator of the Lone Ranger was from Buffalo, New York, where I'm from, my hometown, where I'm based out of. And I said, well, that can't possibly be true because I'm a Buffalo-based writer. I would have heard about if the guy who wrote the Lone Ranger was from here. Buffalo is very good about celebrating people who grew up here or have some connection here and have gone on to be successful. Like the Google Dolls are from Buffalo. Joyce Carol Oates was born here and grew up here. So we're very good about celebrating it, people like that. And I never heard about Fran Stryker. So I said, well, you're wrong. And of course, I whip out my phone, I Google it, and it turns out that not only Fran was from Buffalo, he was from the neighborhood I was living in. He went to high school 2 blocks up the street. He lived over in Granger Place, just north of me. I did some more digging and found out he not only wrote The Lone Ranger, he also wrote The Green Hornet and Sergeant Preston the Yukon and the Tom Quest book series. I've never heard of the man. I said, well, how could this possibly be? And so I did a little bit more research. And I think one of the reasons why, the main reason why, is because he sold the rights to the Lone Ranger for $10. And the man he sold it to, George W. Trendle, this station owner of WXYZ in Detroit, started claiming in interviews that he was the creator of the Lone Ranger. And he kept repeating that lie until his death in the early 1970s. And so Fran never got kind of the recognition that a Stan Lee has gotten, during his career. So that's how I found out about Fran.
And what made you decide to tell Fran Stryker's story?
Well, I figure I had to, right? I mean, it was too good of a story. And he did sell the rights for $10. But in Fran's defense, he did it for all the right reasons. It was 1933, in the depths of the Depression. Fran had a wife and 2 small children. Plus, he was supporting about a dozen members of his extended family who had lost everything in the Depression. And he was financially responsible for them. And so money was tight. He was, working for WEBR, a local radio station here in town. He was selling scripts across the nation for between $2 and $6 an episode for extra cash. And that's how he and Trendle crossed paths, because by 1932, end of 32, Trendle was buying about 4 episodes a week from Fran, recycled old scripts that Fran was sending out. And he came to him and said, hey, can you write a Western? The usual stuff, bank robbers, girl tied to railroad tracks, etc. And Fran said, sure. And he dug out an old episode called Covered Wagon Days. And for whatever reason, he chose episode number 10 and reworked that and introduced this idea of the Lone Ranger. And he was selling them to Trendle for about $4 an episode. Fast forward about a year, 1930, I guess 34 is now. The Rangers just started to take off. They got a national advertiser, and Trendle was a smart businessman. And so that's when he came to Stryker with this deal. He knew of Fran's financial responsibilities at home and said, hey, I'll offer you a job of being a full-time writer for WXYZ, a good salary, steady income, job security through the Depression. But the catch is you have to sell me the rights to the Lone Ranger for $10. And of course, what do? You have to support your family. At this point, Fran had never had a national hit, no less a national sponsor. He had written dozens of radio series up to that point. None of them had really been super successful. Some lasted 4 episodes, some lasted 20. So he took the deal. And depending how you look at it, it was either the best deal in entertainment history or the worst deal in entertainment history. Because, of course, when Trendle went to sell the rights in 1954, when the Ranger was making the transition to television, he sold it for over $3 million, which was a record sale at the time. And then when NBC Universal bought it, I guess about 10 years ago, they paid over $3 billion for it. And of course, Stryker and his heirs, never saw any of that.
Steve Eoannou is our guest. We're in conversation about Yesteryear, his newest story about the man who helped create the Lone Ranger. His website is SGEoannou.com. You cover a lot of bases in the book, Steve, with some real-life events and real people in the cast. Give us a feel for Yesteryear's timeline.
Well, I focus on the period of time when Stryker was first approached from Trendle up until the Rangers premiere. And I kind of condensed some timelines there. And I really, coming off of Muscle Cars, which were very spare stories, and Rook, which is sort of a crime novel, I felt like I wanted to write something more along the lines of Shoeless Joe by W.P. Kinsella, that Field of Dreams was based on, and The Natural, which, of course, was a movie with Robert Redford, also filmed in Buffalo, New York, by the way. I wanted to write something that was very lush with some magical realism, based in historic fact. So it reads much different than Muscle Cars and Yesteryear because it deals with the idea of, where do stories come from? Where did Fran come up with, a horse named Silver and Kemosabe and silver bullets? And, the answer is this, stories are all around us, and we take what we need when we need it. Sometimes it's filed away, and then when we need it, it's there. It's very kind of mystical and magical. And those elements are in the story. And because I was thinking of those 2 baseball novels, Shoeless Joe and The Natural, I had this mantra in my head that swing for the fences. And to me, that was no stroke was too broad, no joke was off limits, no sentence is too long and winding and, musical. Just swing for it. What do you have to lose? And so was my mindset going in. So it's a fun book to write. It was a fun book to research, and I'm hoping it's going to be a fun book to read.
Is it easier to write stories that reference actual events than it is to write straight fiction?
Well, the Rook and certainly Yesteryear are in that vein. It's kind of a both. It's a double-edged sword. It's easier because, the basic plot points of somebody's life is laid out for you. I know when this person was arrested. I know when he went to jail. I know when he was paroled. With Fran, I knew when the Lone Ranger premiered in Buffalo before it went to Detroit. I knew the major characters. The John L. Barrett, who was a local Buffalo actor, played the Lone Ranger one time, and he was the first Lone Ranger because it premiered in Buffalo as a test pilot before going to Detroit. He's in there. Jimmy Slattery, who was the former lightweight heavy champion of the world from South Buffalo, is in there. Mafioso Stephen Magdiano, who ran the Buffalo Mob for decades, he's in there, and he's in love. All these people were in Buffalo around the same time. So it was easy because I could research them, and I knew physical descriptions and things like that. It's harder because you want to be true to their story, but you also want to be creative and tell something that's entertaining. The story was really trying to be kind of myth making, if you will, about how this Lone Ranger came to be and how he lasted 90 years, because this year is the 90th anniversary of the Rangers broadcast debut. So everything's kind of lining up in that way. So it's easier, it's harder. The next novel that's coming out in a couple of years, in 2025, purely a figment of my imagination. So it is set in Buffalo. That's kind of my turf, but it is purely a figment of my imagination.
We're in conversation with Stephen G. Eoannou. Yesteryear, a fictional imagining of the life of Lone Ranger creator Fran Stryker during his time as a struggling writer in Buffalo, New York. He is out now in both digital and paperback editions. Steve's website is sgeoannou.com. Steve, both you and Fran have been struggling writers. Do you feel any connection with his experience?
Slightly. I love Fran, or what I know of Fran Stryker, because he was such a big-hearted guy, and he worked so hard, and he was so prolific. I guess the difference was it didn't take him 30 years. It's taken him longer to get the recognition, but it didn't take him longer to break through. I guess what Fran and I have in common is neither one of us quit. We kept writing and kept getting not the results that we wanted, but we hung in there. And, I think one of the tenets of the Lone Ranger's creed is that truth will always live on. And I think I like to think that Fran took solace in that, knowing that eventually people were going to realize his contribution to 20th century pop culture. He is in the National Broadcasting Hall of Fame. He is in the Buffalo Broadcasting Hall of Fame. But he's not a household name. Like I always think of Stan Lee, the great comic book creator. He's not in that league just because of the lie that was told. So it's when I tell people when I'm being interviewed, it's really good to be here. After 30 years, it's really good to be here.
What made you stick with it until you found an audience?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it never occurred to me to stop. I think with a writer, that's what we do. Right? Look, I'm not going to write anymore. I'm just going to be a reader, or I'm just going to write book reviews. That's writing. But then I'll say, oh, that's a good idea for a story. And the next thing you know, you're up at 5 a.m. and you're trying to work it out. And so it just really never entered my mind. And the way I try to explain it to people is I say, well, look, there's millions of people who play golf on the weekend, and they're never going to play in the Masters. And there's millions of people that play tennis on the weekend, and they're never going to go to Wimbledon. I'm going to be one of those guys that I don't golf, I don't play tennis, I write, and I'll never be published, but that's what I'm going to do. That's my thing. And I kept trying. I was sending things out, and they were being rejected. But I hung in there, and something happened about 10 years ago. Whether it's I had lived long enough and had matured enough and had something to say, or if I just after 30 years, if you do anything for 30 years, you're going to get better at it sooner than later, right? You hope. But things started happening. Some things clicked, and like I said, I've got 2 books out. The third comes out in October. The fourth one comes out in 2025. So yeah, I'm enjoying this part of my writing career much more than the first 30.
Steve Eoannou is our guest. What was the turning point in your writing career?
Well, I know going an MFA program isn't for everybody, but I went to Queen's University of Charlotte, I guess, in 2009. I graduated in 2011. And I think that was a turning point for me. And again, MFA programs aren't for everybody. It's a time commitment. It's a monetary commitment. But I think one of the best things was just surrounding myself with these creative people and other writers. And when I joined the program, Fred Lebron, the director, said, the only thing I can promise you is you're going to leave here with a network of writers to share your work with. And he was absolutely right. And I think that was invaluable to get their feedback. The other thing, I worked with a great writer named David Payne. and I was trying to write this novel called Slip Kid. It was actually, it ended up being a short story in muscle cars. Didn't make it as a novel. And after about my third chapter, I think he was, tired of reading this. And he did something very painful and very generous at the same time. He took the entire chapter, like 20, 25 pages, and redlined it like he was going to edit it. And it looked like a murder scene because he did use red ink. Because this is the way I would rewrite it. And I studied that all summer. And I learned about economy of words, economies of sentences, trying to figure out why he cut certain things or moved certain things. And that was a huge, painful exercise, but it made me a better writer for my second year at Queen.
And the proof, as they say, is in the pudding. Yesteryear is getting rave reviews, and the story of the Lone Ranger creator Fran Stryker is available now wherever cool books are sold and online at Amazon. The website is sgeoannou.com. Steve, congratulations on a great book, and thanks for joining us in conversation.
Well, thank you so much. It's been fun. It's always fun telling Fran's story.
In Conversation with Terry Shepard is a copyrighted presentation. All rights reserved. I'm Lisa Davis. Join Terry Shepard next time in Conversation.